For most kids growing up in Detroit's East Side, dreams don't make it past the neighborhood. The streets teach you fast how to keep your head down, how to stretch a dollar, how to stop expecting birthdays to come with cake. Julian learned young that survival came before celebration. He remembered the click of the front door every night at 2 a.m. His mother coming home from her janitor's shift, shoes soaked, fingers raw, whispering apologies to a sleeping boy who always stayed awake just long enough to hear her voice. They shared a one-bedroom apartment with walls thin enough to hear the neighbors fight, laugh, or cry. Julian didn't mind the noise. What scared him more was silence, the kind that came after his father left and never came back. No goodbye, no explanation, just an empty chair at the dinner table and a weight his mother never said out loud, but carried in her back and her bones. Books became his escape. Old, torn paperbacks from the church donation bin. He taught himself to read by age 4. By age 10, he was fixing neighbors' broken radios just to buy used textbooks. He didn't just want to be smart. He had to be. At school, teachers called him the quiet one. But he was never idle. While others played basketball, Julian studied under streetlights. When his classmates were suspended, he sat in the principal's office helping with paperwork to avoid being sent home to an empty apartment. He remembered once overhearing 2 guidance counselors whispering, "Kids like him don't make it out." He never forgot that. Julian didn't dream of being rich. He dreamed of being free from worry, from eviction notices, from the shame of handing in lunch vouchers instead of cash. And when the letter from Harvard came, thick envelope, gold seal, he didn't scream. He didn't cry. He sat on the edge of his twin bed, held the letter to his chest, and whispered, "Mom, we made it." But she wasn't there to hear it. She was still at work, mopping a hospital hallway under flickering lights, cleaning up after people who'd never know her name. That night, he left the envelope on the kitchen table with a note. "I'll make this count. I promise." But Julian Hayes, he was different. He wasn't just smart. He was exceptional. Top of his class, perfect SAT scores, a quiet boy with calloused hands and tired eyes. His mother worked night shifts as a janitor. His father? Gone since Julian was 4. And yet somehow, against every odd, Julian got into Harvard. It was the kind of headline that makes the local news. Detroit teen defies poverty, heads to Harvard on full ride. But once you're in Harvard, the struggle doesn't end. Julian juggled 3 part-time jobs, cleaning dorms, shelving books at the library, even delivering groceries, just to afford winter coats and textbooks. He barely slept. He barely ate. Then, in his junior year, everything changed. He signed up for a university-sponsored caregiving program, one that matched students with elderly residents in need of companionship or basic help. It paid $15 an hour. Julian needed the money. That's how he met Eleanor Whitmore. Eleanor was 71 years old, a reclusive billionaire widow living in a private estate in Cape Cod. Her late husband had built one of the largest media conglomerates on the East Coast. After his death, Eleanor disappeared from the spotlight. No interviews, no parties, just silence. The first time Julian met her, he thought she looked fragile. Thin white hair pulled into a bun, pale skin, eyes that held a kind of sadness that didn't go away with time. But she was kind and sharp. She called him Mr. Harvard with a half smile. He called her Ms. Eleanor out of respect, even though she told him not to. He read books to her, carried groceries, fixed her printer. Over time, their conversations shifted from errands and bills to life, loss, and loneliness. "Do you believe people can be born into the wrong life, Julian?" "Sometimes," he said, "but I think people can fight their way out of it, too." Eleanor began to see Julian as more than just a student. He reminded her of the son she never had. He listened, he cared, and he never asked for anything. That's what made her next decision so unusual. Before Eleanor ever mentioned wills or marriages, there were afternoons. Quiet, still afternoons where the world seemed to pause between cups of tea and slow-spoken stories. Julian had grown, used to silence. But with Eleanor, it was different. It wasn't the heavy silence of Detroit nights. It was gentle, like the hush of a turning page or the pause before laughter. She began to talk more. About her husband, Arthur Whitmore, a media tycoon who had loved headlines more than home. About the estate, rooms she no longer entered, books she never finished reading. And about the children she'd once held close, who now called only when lawyers insisted. "Do you know what it's like," she asked once, "to raise people who forget you raised them?" Julian didn't answer, but he reached across the table and refilled her teacup, not out of duty, but because it felt like the only thing he could do. There was one afternoon that stuck with him. A storm had rolled over Cape Cod. Wind lashed the windows, and the sea groaned in the distance. The power flickered once, twice, and then darkness. Eleanor lit a single candle. "Don't go," she said, not as a command, but almost like a child. "Just sit with me a while." So he did. They sat on the floor of her study, backs against towering shelves of first editions and forgotten awards. She told him about her first date with Arthur, how he spilled red wine on her dress and apologized by sending 20 bouquets of white roses the next morning. "I should have left then," she said with a sad laugh. "I married Charm, but charm grows old when it forgets to listen." Julian told her about his mother, about her laugh, about the way she'd hum Billie Holiday when scrubbing the bathtub. She used to say, if you can't afford peace, then find quiet. Eleanor closed her eyes. "You remind me of her," he added. They didn't speak again for a long time. The candle flickered. The storm passed. And when the lights came back on, Eleanor looked different. Not younger, not happier, just less alone. The next week, she gave him a gift. It wasn't expensive, just a photo, a small, framed picture of Eleanor as a young woman holding a baby boy. "My firstborn," she said. "He died before his second birthday." Julian didn't know what to say, so he didn't. "I don't show this to people, not even my other children. They think I've forgotten, but I haven't. I just learned to pretend." She set the frame in Julian's hands. "You feel like a second chance." That night, Julian stared at the photo long after he got back to his dorm. He couldn't explain it. The knot in his chest, the warmth beneath the weight of grief. She wasn't trying to buy him. She wasn't trying to guilt him. She was trying to be remembered by someone who wouldn't sell her story to tabloids, by someone who didn't ask her for anything but still chose to stay. And that was when something changed in Julian, something quiet but permanent. He no longer called her Ms. Eleanor. He called her Eleanor, and she smiled every time. One morning, as they sat on the porch drinking tea, Eleanor turned to him and said, "Julian, if I died tomorrow, you'd have nothing. But you've given me more peace than my own children ever did. I want to give something back. Something real." He shook his head. "You've already done more than enough, Ms. Eleanor." But she insisted. She told him she wanted to leave him part of her estate, a gesture of gratitude. Julian protested at first, unsure what to make of it. Then came the catch. "My lawyers, my children, they'd never allow it. The only legal way to make this clean is if you and I marry." Julian stared at her in disbelief. He wasn't in love with her. She wasn't in love with him. But there was no romance in her offer, only deep gratitude, legal protection, and a silent cry for dignity in her final years. "I'm not asking for a wedding. No honeymoon. Just your signature. You walk away after I'm gone with a future worth something." For days, Julian wrestled with it. Was it ethical? Was it wrong? Or was this woman, who had given him peace, kindness, and faith, simply trying to make one last human connection before she passed? In the end, Julian said yes. And that decision would cost him everything. Julian didn't say yes right away. That night, he lay on the stiff mattress in his dorm room, staring at the ceiling as the radiator clanked like distant artillery. His roommate was gone for the weekend, and the silence gave his thoughts room to shout. He wasn't thinking about money. Not really. He thought about what people would say, what his professors would whisper, what his mother, God rest her soul, might have thought of all this. Marry a woman older than your grandmother? What are you desperate? A whore and a tie. He'd heard those kind of jokes before, usually aimed at others, never aimed at him. Until now. But it wasn't just that. Julian remembered sitting across from Eleanor in her sunlit kitchen earlier that day. She had made tea, not for herself, but for him. She'd taken the time to learn how he liked it. No sugar, extra lemon. And when she'd made the offer, not out of romance, but as a legal arrangement to protect her estate, she looked at him like he was the only person in the world she trusted. I don't want my children to inherit my legacy, she had said softly. They've already forgotten who I am. But you, Julian, you remind me of who I used to be proud to be. That stuck with him. Long after the sun set and the sky over Cambridge turned to ink, Julian lay with a knot in his chest. He thought about the scholarship deadlines, the part-time job he was about to lose, and the landlord's letter threatening eviction. He also thought about the way Eleanor's hand had trembled slightly when she passed him the prenup. She wasn't doing this for control. She wasn't trying to own him. She was trying to make one last good decision before she died. And maybe, just maybe, he could honor that. The next morning, Julian looked in the mirror, and for the first time in weeks, he saw something more than stress and hunger staring back. He saw a man about to change someone's life. Yes, he whispered to himself. Not for me, for her. And so he said it out loud. To Eleanor, to the notary, to the quiet echo inside him still longing for his mother's voice. Yes, the wedding was as quiet as the agreement itself. No gown, no tux, just Julian Hayes in a borrowed suit 2 sizes too big, and Eleanor Whitmore, wearing a pale blue cardigan and a wide-brimmed hat to cover her thinning hair. They married on a Thursday morning at the Barnstable County Courthouse. The clerk looked confused, not because of the age gap, but because neither of them smiled once. There was no celebration, no family, no cake, just 2 signatures and a whispered thank you from Eleanor. This doesn't change anything, Julian told her in the car. I know, she replied softly, but it protects everything I want to leave behind. She handed him a sealed envelope. It contained a newly updated will, naming Julian as a partial heir to $12 million, a fraction of her estate, but more money than Julian could even imagine. Julian didn't sleep much that night, not because he was restless, but because Eleanor insisted they sit on the porch together and watch the stars. She brought out 2 wool blankets and a tin of ginger biscuits she said she'd been saving for a real occasion. Julian chuckled. And marry me qualifies as that. She winked. It's not every day an old woman pulls off the biggest plot twist of her life. They didn't talk about the will, or money, or her children. Instead, Eleanor asked him about the moon. Do you think it feels lonely up there? She whispered. Julian shook his head. No, I think it just waits patiently for someone to notice it. The next morning, Eleanor cooked him breakfast, eggs and toast that she half-burned, then insisted were extra crispy, just how the French do it. He pretended to believe her. They walked around the garden afterward, slowly. Eleanor held his arm like she needed it, not because of her age, but because she was savoring the feeling of being connected. She pointed to the hydrangeas along the southern wall. Arthur hated those, said they reminded him of funerals. And you kept them? Julian asked. Of course, she smiled. They remind me of rebirth. That afternoon, Eleanor showed him an old music box. It played a lullaby Julian had never heard. Soft, almost haunting. I used to play this when I couldn't sleep, she said. Does it still work? Just barely. Like me. She laughed at her own joke. But Julian didn't. He just watched her. The way she gently ran her fingers over the box's faded wood. The way her eyes misted but didn't spill. That evening, as the sky turned amber, she told him, "You've made me feel young again, Julian. Not in body, but in soul." He didn't know how to respond. So he simply said, "Thank you for trusting me." She turned to him, her voice quieter than ever. "You were the first person in years who didn't look at me like a bank account or a burden. You saw a person, and I'll never forget that." She reached into the drawer and handed him something, a faded envelope with his name handwritten on the front. "Open it only if I'm not here to explain it." Julian frowned. "Don't say that. I'm not planning anything, dear. But I've lived long enough to know nothing is promised. Except maybe regret, if we don't say what needs to be said." They sat on the porch again that night. No biscuits, no stars, just the sound of ocean wind and rocking chairs. Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder for the first time. Not romantically, not dramatically, just gently, like someone finally at peace. And Julian, for the first time in years, whispered a prayer. Not for himself, but for her. Let her sleep. Let her be safe. Let this peace last, even if it's only for tonight. She also told him not to open it. Not unless something happens, which it won't. But something did happen. 2 days later, on a Saturday evening, police were called to Eleanor's estate by a housekeeper who had arrived early for her overnight shift. She found Eleanor dead in her bedroom, slumped in a velvet armchair by the fireplace. A single gunshot wound to her head. Blood on the rug. A small pistol, registered in Eleanor's name, still resting on the floor. Julian was in the house. He said he had been in the guest wing, working on a paper for a constitutional law class. He told police he hadn't seen Eleanor since lunch. But things didn't look good. There was no sign of forced entry. The security system had been disabled for scheduled maintenance. Julian's fingerprints were found on the gun, and the newly signed will, naming him as heir, was discovered on Eleanor's desk. By Monday, headlines exploded across the country. Collision: Harvard gold digger marries billionaire widow. She's dead within 48 hours. Collision: from poverty to murder. Julian Hayes accused of killing wife for inheritance. The public didn't wait for a trial. They judged him guilty in the court of opinion. Eleanor's children, especially her eldest son, Michael Whitmore, held a press conference outside the estate, flanked by lawyers and reporters. "My mother was manipulated, taken advantage of. She was vulnerable, and this boy exploited her. We want justice. Full justice." Michael's voice cracked, but his words were sharp. He married her for the money. Then he killed her to get it. Julian was arrested that same afternoon, still wearing the same suit from the courthouse wedding. The arrest photo showed him dazed, eyes red, mouth slightly open like he hadn't yet caught up with reality. Inside the holding cell, when asked why he looked so numb, Julian said quietly, "Because I don't know how to grieve and defend myself at the same time." But grief wouldn't protect him, because within 72 hours, Julian Hayes was formally charged with first-degree murder, a crime that, if convicted, could lock him away for life. But behind the tears of a grieving family, something darker was already hiding, and no one, not even Julian, could imagine how far they were willing to go to keep the truth buried. They called it the Whitmore wedding murder. The prosecution called it a calculated killing masked as charity. But Julian called it something else. A nightmare that didn't wake up. From the moment he stepped into that cold courtroom, Julian Hayes was no longer a student. He was a spectacle, sitting alone in a cheap suit, with court-appointed attorneys and no family in the gallery. Julian looked like what the media painted him to be, a desperate boy who'd reached too high and killed when the dream slipped away. But what the cameras didn't show was the truth he carried silently. The trial moved fast. Too fast. Prosecutors leaned heavily on circumstantial evidence. His fingerprints on the gun. The last person to see Eleanor alive. The new will written just days before her death. No forensic expert could definitively say he pulled the trigger. But the motive was obvious, they claimed. Money. The jury ate it up. And then came Michael Whitmore. He took the stand, well-dressed, eloquent, and grieving. My mother was sick. She was vulnerable. She never would have married someone like Julian unless she was manipulated. He wiped his eyes at the perfect moments. He recounted suspicious behavior, claimed Eleanor felt scared in the days leading up to her death, though no written record or witness ever confirmed that. Still, the courtroom believed him because he looked like wealth, and Julian looked like the reason people feared giving the poor too much access to the rich. Julian tried to speak up, to explain, but his lawyer advised against it. They already think you're guilty. Don't give them your voice too. So he sat and watched his life disappear behind closing statements. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours. Enough time to order lunch, talk casually, and return with a verdict that sucked the air out of Julian's chest. We find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder. Julian blinked. Once. Twice. Then tears welled up. Not out of fear, but out of betrayal. She trusted me, he whispered. She trusted me. The judge sentenced him to 20 years to life, with no possibility of parole for at least a decade. Julian didn't remember the sound of the gavel. He didn't hear the gasps in the gallery. All he remembered was the ache in his chest, like something had cracked, but no one else could hear it. As the bailiff tightened the cuffs, Julian looked toward the back of the courtroom. Empty benches. No one waiting. No one crying for him. And in that moment, he realized he didn't just lose his freedom, he lost his place in the world. The transport van smelled of bleach and metal. He stared at his reflection in the scratched-up plexiglass and barely recognized the face looking back. Jaw clenched, eyes vacant, like someone halfway between grief and disbelief. At intake, a guard asked him. First time. Julian nodded. You'll learn quick, the guard said, not unkindly. The innocent ones always do. His first night in prison, Julian couldn't sleep. He lay on the thin cot, staring at the ceiling, replaying every second of that morning. Eleanor's quiet smile, the last time he heard her laugh, the envelope still unopened. He didn't cry. Not then. That came later. It came 3 weeks into his sentence when another inmate, a man with tattoos up to his jaw, asked casually, So what did you do to that old lady? Julian didn't answer. He just stood there, frozen, while laughter echoed down the hallway like knives against concrete. They didn't know her. They didn't know him. But it didn't matter. He was already guilty, not just in court, but in the stories others told when no one else was around to contradict them. He wrote letters he never sent. To the judge, to the jury, to Eleanor. You believed in me, and I couldn't protect you. I didn't even hear the shot. He stopped signing them after a while, because names like innocence don't carry much weight behind bars. The early years were the hardest. Julian thought prison would be loud, full of shouting, metal clanks, and commands barked through speakers. But it wasn't the noise that got to him. It was the quiet moments, the gaps between sounds, when the walls seemed to lean in and ask, Who are you without the world watching? The first time he was called a widow killer by another inmate, it didn't sting. It burned. The second time, he didn't react. By the 10th, he just looked away. They didn't know Eleanor. They never saw the way her hands trembled when pouring tea, or how she hummed softly when walking past her late husband's portrait. To them, she was just a headline. To him, she had been home. Julian tried to keep his head down. He volunteered to work in the prison library, where he could shelve torn paperbacks and sneak glances at dusty volumes of case law. For hours, he'd trace the spines of legal texts, wondering how so many pages of justice could miss someone like him. He rarely spoke to other inmates, not because he felt above them, but because he didn't trust himself not to break apart mid-sentence. His words had already failed him once, during a trial that moved too fast, with a voice he wasn't allowed to use. One night, a man named Rico, older, tattooed, and with sad eyes that looked decades older than his body, pulled Julian aside in the yard. "You're the Harvard kid," he said, lighting a cigarette with hands that shook just enough to betray the calm. Julian nodded. "Don't try to prove anything in here. Not your innocence. Not your smarts. Just survive." That was the first piece of advice Julian took seriously. But survival came at a price. There were nights when he couldn't sleep, not because of noise, but because of memory. The smell of ginger biscuits. The sound of Eleanor's laugh. The weight of a cardigan she draped on his shoulders that one stormy night. He clutched those fragments like a man drowning holds his last breath. Once, he folded a paper napkin into the shape of a wedding ring, placed it on his finger, took it off, then crushed it in his fist, ashamed of how much he missed feeling chosen. Other times, he'd lie awake replaying that one morning, the day Eleanor had made him extra crispy eggs and pointed out the flowers Arthur hated. "I should have died with her," he muttered once, under his breath, unaware a guard had heard. The next morning, they moved him to a watch list for suicidal ideation. He told them he was fine. He wasn't. It took him nearly 4 years to start writing again. Not for lawyers or reporters, but for himself. He scribbled thoughts onto the backs of receipts, napkins, old envelopes. Truth is silent when shouted over. Grief doesn't ask for proof. I miss being believed. Sometimes, he wrote letters to Eleanor, not to ask for anything, just to talk. "Do you remember the music box? It plays in my head when I'm trying to block out the noise. You were the only person who looked at me without suspicion. I still hear your voice, Eleanor, especially when I forget my own." He never sent those letters. There was nowhere to send them. One winter night, the power in the cell block went out. Total darkness. The emergency lights failed. For a full 20 minutes, the prison was silent. Julian sat on his bunk and whispered her name once. And for reasons he couldn't explain, the silence felt comforting. Not because it was peaceful, but because it was hers. The worst part wasn't the cold, or the noise, or the smell. It was how easy it was to forget who you used to be. Julian once stood in Harvard's Whitmore library at midnight, running his fingers along the spines of books older than America itself. He once believed law was about truth, about justice. Now, he filed behind murderers for breakfast, waited in lines for showers, counted cracks in the wall to stay sane. One night, he folded his blanket into the shape of a diploma, a sad, lumpy square, and whispered, "Come loudy, mother," just like I promised. He smiled and then broke. Tears came in silence. No sobbing, no shaking, just wet cheeks on a thin pillow while the world on the outside forgot he ever existed. Some nights, he'd close his eyes and hear Eleanor's voice. "You remind me of who I used to be proud to be." He held on to that, tighter than anything else, because even in a place built to erase you, her words still made him feel like a person. Just barely. Just like that, Julian Hayes, a Harvard student once destined for law school, a courtroom of his own, was led away in handcuffs. He didn't get to finish college, didn't get to say goodbye to his mother, who died of a stroke 6 months after his sentencing. No funeral, no letters, no justice. Inside prison, Julian learned quickly that innocence doesn't protect you. That silence is dangerous. And that time moves differently when you know you didn't do it. They say prison changes you, he wrote once. But no one tells you what it takes first. Your hope, your name, your memories. But beyond the prison walls, someone was watching. Someone who wasn't convinced. And the truth about Eleanor's death, the one thing that could save him, was buried under wealth, power, and a brother's ruthless ambition. Because while Julian rotted behind bars, the real killer was sipping champagne in Manhattan, and he thought no one would ever come looking. For Julian Hayes, the hardest part of prison wasn't the walls. It was the silence. No one wrote. No one called. No one visited. His mother passed away 6 months into his sentence. He found out from a printed obituary someone slipped under his cell door. No goodbye. No final words. She died believing I did it, he wrote in a letter he never sent. I'm not sure what's worse, being alone or being forgotten. The prison guards knew who he was. Some called him Gold Digger. Others didn't bother with names, just numbers and orders. Sometimes he'd stare at the wall for hours, like he was somewhere else. Somewhere Harvard still existed. Somewhere Eleanor was still alive. The courts wouldn't reopen the case. There was no new evidence. Just the same old story, repackaged, reprinted, and reburied. Julian began to wither, not just in body, but in spirit. Stopped telling other inmates he was innocent, because saying it too many times made it sound like a lie, even to himself. He once told a chaplain, "If the world forgets you, do you still exist?" Enter Linda Romero, a 58-year-old investigative journalist turned true crime podcaster. Linda had built her career uncovering wrongful convictions. She wasn't interested in sensational headlines. She cared about what was buried beneath them. She found Julian's case while researching another story. But something about it wouldn't let her go. The camera footage mysteriously disabled. The rush timeline. The way Michael Whitmore dominated the media narrative. And most of all, Eleanor Whitmore's sealed psychiatric records, which were never allowed into court. Linda dug deeper, and what she found chilled her to the bone. A whistleblower, a former paralegal from the Whitmore estate law firm, contacted her anonymously. They claimed Eleanor had written a private letter just 2 days before her death, addressed to her attorney, but never delivered. In it, she wrote, "If anything happens to me, look to Michael first. He's already asked to void the new will. He doesn't want the world to know I chose a stranger over my own children." The letter had never been submitted to court. It had been buried. Linda requested access to more files. She hit walls, stonewalled by Whitmore's legal team. But the more resistance she faced, the more convinced she became. Julian Hayes didn't kill Eleanor Whitmore, she said on her podcast. Someone else did. And the world was too quick to believe the wrong story. Back in prison, Julian didn't know any of this. Not yet. He woke every day the same way he had for 10 years, with numb hands, cold breath, and the sound of chains clinking down the hallway. But something was coming. Something he couldn't see. A woman with a microphone, a folder full of documents, and a fire that refused to die. The truth was still out there. It had been whispered, hidden, ignored, but now it had a voice. For nearly 11 years, Julian Hayes had lived in a cell. But on a rainy Tuesday morning in March, the prison warden knocked on his door and said 5 words he never expected to hear. "You have a civilian visit." Julian's first thought? Mistake. His second? Trap. But it wasn't either. It was Linda Romero, trench coat, glasses, leather notebook in hand, staring at him through a foggy visitation window like she'd been waiting a lifetime to ask him one question. "Julian," she said, voice low, "did you kill Eleanor Whitmore?" He met her gaze, tired and unreadable. "No," he said, "but nobody ever really asked me that before. Not like they meant it." She listened. She took notes. She asked questions no lawyer had ever bothered with. She didn't interrupt. She didn't assume. Then she dropped a bomb. "I have something you need to see." She slid a photocopy of a letter through the glass. Julian's fingers trembled as he read the words Eleanor had written. words she never got to send. If anything happens to me, look to Michael first. Julian's breath caught. For the first time in over a decade, he cried. Linda didn't sleep that night. Back in her hotel room, she stared at her notes spread across the bed like puzzle pieces that had been forced to fit the wrong picture for too long. A bottle of stale coffee sat untouched on the desk. The glow from her laptop illuminated old headlines. Harvard gold digger marries billionaire widow. She's dead within 48 hours. She muttered, lazy, convenient, dead wrong. At 3:17 a.m., she called her editor, a gruff man named Rob who had once told her to leave this case alone. You're still on this? He groaned. I just saw him, Linda whispered. And he's not a killer. Linda, they found his prints on the weapon. There was a will. There was a story, she cut in. Not the truth. You taught me the difference. There was a long pause. Don't go getting yourself sued again. But he didn't hang up. That was permission enough. The next morning, Linda put on her old trench coat, the one with fraying sleeves and 3 hidden audio recorders sewn into the lining, and drove to the Whitmore estate in Cape Cod. The gates were still there. Taller now, sharper, colder. She wasn't allowed in, but she didn't need to be. She parked down the street and knocked on the door of a neighbor, a woman in her 80s named Mrs. Caldwell, who'd lived next to Eleanor for decades. Lovely woman, the old lady said, pouring tea without asking. Quiet. Too quiet after Arthur died. Linda leaned in. Did anything seem off in the days before her death? Mrs. Caldwell frowned. Her son came by. Michael, loud man, drove a car that cost more than my house. Linda pulled out a notebook. Did they argue? No shouting, no. But she didn't look right the next day. Like something had been taken out of her. That was the second thread. The first had been the whistleblower paralegal. Now came a third. Linda spent days requesting documents from the Whitmore family's estate law firm. She hit walls, denials, delays, silence. But one night, a courier slipped an unmarked envelope under her hotel door. Inside was a single security log. Whitmore Estate, camera override, admin ID, MW 1981. Timestamp, 2:13 p.m., March 12th. The same afternoon, Eleanor died. Linda exhaled shakily. She was getting close, which meant it was going to get dangerous. 2 nights later, as she returned to her hotel room, she noticed the door was ajar. Inside, nothing missing, but her laptop had been powered on, and her audio files deleted. She sat on the edge of the bed, heart pounding, and whispered, You're scared of what I'll find. The next morning, she changed hotels and encrypted everything. But the final piece came from a place she never expected, a care facility in upstate New York. There, she found a retired hospice nurse who had once cared for Eleanor after a minor stroke years earlier. The nurse, a quiet woman named Francine, agreed to speak, but only off the record. She was terrified of her son, Francine said. Never said it directly, but once she whispered he thinks kindness is weakness. Did she ever say she was afraid for her life? No, but she hid her medication under the mattress when he visited. Said she didn't want him checking the bottles. I thought it was paranoia. Linda leaned forward. It wasn't. Francine closed her eyes. Oh God, I should have said something back then. You're saying it now. Back in Boston, Linda sat at a diner, staring at Eleanor's photocopied letter again. The one that began, If anything happens to me, look to Michael first. She whispered into her recorder. Eleanor Whitmore knew what was coming. She tried to protect Julian Hayes, and the system failed them both. For the first time in a decade, someone had listened. Someone had looked. And the story the world thought they knew. The simple, scandalous tale of a gold digger and a rich old woman was starting to unravel. Linda knew she wasn't done. She was just getting started. Over the next 6 months, Linda did what no defense team had done in Julian's original trial. She dug deeper. And what she found would change everything. Magnifying glass tilted left, what Linda uncovered. 1. Deleted surveillance footage. Linda obtained archived IT logs from Whitmore's estate security company. Records showing someone had manually disabled the camera system from within the home. Only 2 people had the admin passcode, Eleanor and Michael. Julian? He never even had the Wi-Fi password. 2. A hidden threat. A former housekeeper, now retired in Arizona, agreed to speak with Linda off record. She remembered something odd days before the wedding. Ms. Eleanor looked nervous. Said her son was coming to talk sense into her about the will. Next day, she had a bruise on her wrist, said she slipped. But her hands were shaking. The housekeeper had told the lawyers, but they never followed up. 3. The smoking gun, literally. The gun that killed Eleanor was wiped clean, except for Julian's fingerprints on the handle. But Linda pushed for a re-examination using new advanced sweat pore mapping technology, something unavailable during the original trial. And then came the breakthrough. On the trigger, a partial print not belonging to Julian. It matched one person, Michael Whitmore. Linda submitted her findings to the Innocence Project and filed a motion for retrial. Julian sat in his cell when the guards came again. Same knock. Same words. You have a visitor. This time, it was a lawyer. Julian, your case is being reopened. The court's granting a full re-examination, and they're bringing Michael Whitmore in for questioning. Julian didn't speak at first, then quietly said, $12 million. That's what she was willing to give me. Her own son killed her for the rest. Michael was arrested 2 weeks later. He was boarding a private jet to Switzerland when the marshals took him in. When asked if he had anything to say, he smirked. What took you so long? Julian Hayes had waited over 10 years for a moment like this. But freedom wasn't the only thing waiting for him. Because as the court prepared for the retrial, the world was about to hear the truth Eleanor tried to protect, the truth Julian was punished for, and the truth a grieving son tried to silence. And when that truth finally came out, it wouldn't just clear a man's name. It would destroy a legacy. The courtroom looked the same. Same wood paneling. Same polished bench. Same cold, formal stillness. But this time, Julian Hayes wasn't in handcuffs. He sat at the defense table in a clean gray suit, borrowed from his lawyer, slightly too long in the sleeves. But this time, he had something he never had before. A voice. The judge presiding over the hearing was new and not impressed with how the original trial was handled. Julian's new attorney laid out the facts methodically. The letter from Eleanor warning about Michael. The manipulated camera logs. The new fingerprint evidence on the trigger, not Julian's. And the financial motive. If Eleanor's new will went into effect, Michael would lose nearly $80 million. The courtroom listened in stunned silence. Then came the final blow, a recorded deposition from a former estate lawyer who admitted under oath. Yes, we were told to disregard the letter. Mr. Whitmore was very clear. He didn't want it to complicate things. Michael Whitmore sat at the prosecution table, his face calm, but his eyes twitching. He didn't testify. He didn't apologize. But the evidence screamed for him. And after 10 days of testimony, expert witnesses, and the kind of forensic detail the first trial never had, the verdict came swift and brutal. We find the defendant, Julian Hayes, not guilty. Julian didn't cry. He just exhaled like a man who'd been holding his breath for a decade. But that wasn't the end. Michael Whitmore was immediately taken into custody. He was charged with first-degree murder, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to frame an innocent man. At his trial, he pled not guilty, but the jury didn't buy it. He was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His only comment to the media? She gave it all to a stranger. What did she expect? Back in that same courtroom where he once lost everything, Julian was asked by a reporter what justice felt like. He paused, then said quietly, "Justice? Justice would have been not losing my mother, not missing 10 years of my life, not burying the only person who believed in me. This is just survival." Julian walked out of court alone. No crowds, no victory parade, just wind in his face and the blinding light of a world he no longer fully recognized. He went back to Detroit. The neighborhood hadn't changed much, but Julian had. He didn't know what he was supposed to be now. Student? Victim? Survivor? "I'm not sure I'll ever belong anywhere again," he said once. "But at least I get to try." After 10 years in the dark, Julian Hayes was finally free. But the scars, the ones no one saw, would take longer to heal. Julian learned quickly that being free didn't mean being whole. His first week out, everything felt too loud, too fast, too bright. The subway rumbled like an earthquake. Phones buzzed like angry bees. Even the sky, wide and open, felt overwhelming after years of looking at it through bars. He didn't own a phone, didn't have a bank account, didn't know how to use tap to pay at the grocery store. People stared at him like he was strange, but not in a cruel way. Just like he didn't belong. And maybe he didn't. He applied for over 40 jobs in 2 weeks. One interview went well until they Googled his name. The search still showed headlines from 2012. Harvard gold digger accused of murder. The update, the exoneration, was buried on page 5. He rented a room above a laundromat in Roxbury. The landlady was kind but distant. She never asked what he'd been through, and he never offered. At night, Julian sat by the window and watched people walk by with their lives intact, holding grocery bags, laughing into phones, wearing wedding rings. He envied how easily they existed. He kept Eleanor's envelope in his drawer, unopened, even now. He wasn't ready. Some days, he thought about Harvard. He walked past the campus once, stood behind the gates as students rushed between classes, coffee cups in hand, earbuds in ears. No one looked at him. He wasn't angry. He just wasn't part of that world anymore. He started volunteering at a local library, helping kids with homework. One of them, a shy boy named Daryl, reminded him of himself. Same wide eyes, same guarded posture. One day, Daryl asked, "Were you ever in college?" Julian hesitated, then said, "Once, a long time ago." "Did you finish?" "Not yet," Julian smiled, "but I'm still learning." That night, he finally opened the envelope Eleanor had left him. Inside wasn't a check or a will. It was a letter, written in her careful, slanted handwriting. "Dear Julian, if you're reading this, then something has gone wrong. And for that, I am so sorry. I wanted to give you peace, not pain. I wanted to leave behind something good, someone good. You reminded me that kindness isn't foolish, that dignity still matters, that we all deserve to be seen. Whatever happens next, don't let the world decide your worth. You are more than their verdict. You were never my mistake. You were my hope. Eleanor." Julian held the letter for a long time. Then he folded it carefully, placed it in a small frame, and set it beside his bed. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't closure. But it was something solid, something real. And in a world that still didn't know what to do with him, that was enough for now. And as he stood at the edge of his old block, looking up at a gray sky, one thought lingered. "Eleanor, we made it." Julian Hayes never went back to Harvard. The world he had left behind was no longer waiting. In the first few weeks of freedom, Julian learned that being free wasn't the same as being welcome. The world had moved on. Phones no longer had buttons. Cars could drive themselves. People ordered food by tapping screens instead of talking. And people looked at him like he was almost normal, almost trustworthy, almost human. He tried. God, he tried. He showed up at job interviews with iron shirts and steady eyes. He told the truth when asked about his past, and he watched doors close as soon as the words former inmate were spoken. I was exonerated, he once said. That's great. The manager replied with a tight smile. We'll call you. They never did. At night, the apartment above the laundromat felt like a cage without bars. He'd sit at the window, staring at the glowing red letters on the gas station across the street, wondering what it meant to start over when you never really started. He kept Eleanor's letter beside his bed. Sometimes he read it. Sometimes he just held it. But not even her words could protect him from the weight of being forgotten by the same world that once rushed to condemn him. One morning, he walked into a grocery store and froze. At the register, behind a stack of magazines, he saw it. A tabloid from 2012, still in circulation, headlined, "From Harvard to Homicide. Where is Julian Hayes now?" No correction, no retraction, just the same old lie. He left the groceries on the counter and walked out. He didn't cry. That night, he stared at the ceiling fan spinning above his bed and thought, what if I just stopped trying? What if freedom wasn't worth the weight it carried? The next day, he packed a small bag. No note, no plan. He walked to the Charles River Bridge. Not because he wanted to jump, but because he wanted to feel small, to stand above something bigger than himself, even if just for a moment. He stood there, fists clenched on cold railings, breathing in the morning fog like it might explain something the world refused to. Then his phone buzzed. It was a message from Daryl, the shy boy from the library. "Mr. Julian, how do you do fractions again? I forgot. Can I call?" Julian stared at the screen. A simple text. A question. A connection. He turned around and walked away from the edge. Back at his room, he answered the phone. "Hey kid," he said, "let's figure it out together." And just like that, he remembered what being needed felt like. That week, he started writing again. But not just letters or old thoughts. He wrote about what it felt like to be accused, to be forgotten, to be misunderstood by people who had never even looked at him. He wrote through the anger, the grief, the silence. And in that silence, he found something unexpected. His voice. He didn't write for revenge. He wrote because Eleanor once told him, truth doesn't whisper. It waits for someone to give a breath. So he gave it his. His classmates had graduated. The buildings had new renovations. The people who once called him inspiring now avoided eye contact on the street. But he wasn't angry. He was tired. When you've been locked away for 10 years, he said, freedom doesn't feel like fireworks. It feels like fog. He rented a small apartment in Boston, not far from Eleanor's favorite bakery. He visited her grave every week. Always alone, always with flowers. The tombstone was simple. Eleanor Whitmore, 1949 to 2022. She lived with quiet dignity. She gave with fierce love. Julian had paid for it himself. Her children had millions, he said, but I was the only one who brought her flowers. In the months after his release, Julian struggled to find work. No one wants to hire an ex-con, even one proven innocent. He worked in a bookstore, then as a night janitor. He never complained, but behind closed doors he wrote letters, essays, pages of memory and truth, pieces of a life almost erased. And one day, he published a memoir titled 2 Days a Husband, 10 Years a Prisoner. The book became a quiet bestseller, not for its crime, but for its clarity, heartbreak, and the question it left hanging. How many others are still forgotten in cells because the world believed a prettier lie? Julian didn't stop there. He used the book's earnings to start a small foundation, the Eleanor Grace Fund, dedicated to supporting wrongfully convicted prisoners, college students from low-income backgrounds, elderly people at risk of financial abuse. He didn't do it for press. He did it because she would have wanted him to. On what would have been Eleanor's 75th birthday, Julian stood by her grave with a group of students the fund had helped. He looked older now, wiser, still quiet. One of the students asked, "Do you ever wish you could go back and change it all?" Julian smiled, not bitterly, just softly, every single day, but not because of the money, or the time, or the pain. He looked down at the flowers. "I'd change it, so she wouldn't have to die thinking her own children hated her for being kind." This wasn't a story about greed, or murder, or inheritance. This was a story about a woman who tried to do one good thing before she died, and a young man who paid the price for it. But in the end, love, the quiet kind, the hard kind, left something behind that even death couldn't bury. Truth. On his bookshelf sat a single unopened envelope, one his mother had written him before her stroke. He never opened it. Some things Julian decided were meant to stay with the dead.